So put aside the ranger and become who you were born to be. Put aside whatever it is that you think you need to hang on to that makes you important. Put aside whatever identity it is that you think you need to clothe yourself in. Whatever it is that you think other people need to know about you that makes you valid, makes you worth something. It's an easy thing to say, but a super difficult thing to do, right? And our key verse says it like this, Galatians 5:17. The sinful nature wants to do evil, which is just the opposite of what the Spirit wants. And the Spirit gives us desires that are the opposite of what the sinful nature wants. There are obvious things that we don't want to do sinfully, lying, cheating, stealing, that sort of stuff. But our sin nature is actually going to tell us to hang on to some heart issues, some motivational behaviors that seem like good, productive, healthy things, but they are not. And we're going to talk about that a bit today. What we've got today is a sort of spiritual equation. 3 things that you can work into your daily life, godly behaviors, that will get a great result for you. A righteous promise. So do this, do this, do this, and you will get a sum total, a great promise from God. Does that make sense? All right, cool. And I know if you're anything like me, I tend to spend a lot of time just thinking about how I interact with God personally. And I don't spend nearly enough time really considering how my actions or lack thereof affect other people. And Christ commands us to grow His kingdom. But that is not something that we can do under our own steam. And I know that from personal experience. If I put a whole lot of effort into trying to figure out what my next step is supposed to be, then eventually I will crash and burn. I know there are a lot of you out there that can relate to this very thing, for sure. And there can be a lot of insecurity that comes along with chasing Christ. Pastor Ryan talked about that this morning. For me, just walking into a church in the beginning, I just thought, okay, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. They say they want me to be a part of this, but if they knew what was really in my heart, they wouldn't want me to be. I'm sure I'm going to blow it, This feels dorky. I felt that way a lot when I first came to church. And to be honest, there's a part of me standing up here right now that thinks I'm supposed to be churchier than I am. It's a battle that I have all the time. So I'm up here giving a message. I'm supposed to look pastorly. I'm supposed to use churchy phrases. But I just want to be where I'm at with you guys. That's the best I can do. And God will be with us through all of this. He promises, as long as we let Him. But we have to let Him. And we're going to talk a bit today about how to do that. There's a guy in the Bible that illustrates this process beautifully. And his name is Joseph. Not Jesus' earthly father, Joseph. This is an Old Testament Joseph. Lived probably 2,500 years before Jesus' earthly father. But in all likelihood, Jesus' earthly father was named after this Joseph. Was probably raised like Joseph would have been raised. This Joseph is a super godly guy, big figure in the Old Testament in Jewish history. And honestly, there are parallels between him and Jesus' earthly dad. They both trusted God above all else and had no problem doing so. So the first part of our equation that Joseph will model for us, something that we need to do, is choose Jesus. Now, a quick word on that. I know when I first came to church, if somebody would have said, okay, well, how does this guy that lived 2,500 years before Jesus choose Jesus? That would have been a question that came to my mind. Well, a brief explanation of that, everything in the Bible, everything in history points to Jesus. His crucifixion and resurrection was just a moment in time, but everybody in the Old Testament was looking forward to the Messiah, looking forward to Jesus. Everybody after Jesus in that moment in time looks back at Him. Make sense? Cool. So a little bit of history on Joseph before we get into the story. He was the son of Jacob, another super important guy in the Old Testament, a guy who one night wrestled physically with God all night long. Really righteous guy, and he loved Joseph a lot. Loved him so much that his brothers were extremely jealous of this relationship that they had. At one point in the story, it talks about how Jacob made Joseph a richly ornamented robe, which is something that would have typically been reserved for the eldest son in the family. So there was a lot of animosity between Joseph and his brothers, probably not so much on Joseph's part, because when you read the story of Joseph, he really just trusted God, and he doesn't come across as the sort of guy that was ever trying to wield some sort of power over people or be resentful or things like that. You'll see that in the story. But his brothers were not happy with Jacob's love of him. And at one point, Joseph has a couple dreams. And the first dream he goes and he relates to just his brothers. And the dream was, we were out gathering sheaves of grain in the field. And at one point, my sheaf of grain stood straight up, and all of yours, my brother's sheaves of grain, gathered around my sheaf of grain and bowed down to it. And Joseph's brothers did not like this dream at all, of course. They're like, whatever. They're already, resentful of the guy. And they say, so now what, you've got dreams that are saying we're going to serve you? Not a good thing, So Joseph has another dream. This one he tells to his brothers and his father Jacob. And in this dream he said, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to me. And at this point Jacob rebuked him and said, so what are you saying? Myself, your mother, and your brothers are supposed to bow down to you and serve you? This made his brothers just livid. They were super mad. But it says in the Bible that Jacob, Joseph's dad, kept this dream in mind because he was a holy guy. So he was going to keep this in his heart, ponder it for a while. So at one point in the story, Jacob asked Joseph to go find his brothers. His brothers are out grazing their herds in a field somewhere. Wants Joseph to go see what his brothers are up to and come back and give him a report on the situation. So Joseph agrees to do this. He takes off to look for his brothers, and he's wandering around a field trying to figure out where they are when a man sees him and goes up to Joseph, and asks him what he's doing. And that's where our story picks up here. They've moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers, and he found them near Dothan. But when they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, or a pit, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take him down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood, and his brothers agreed. Joseph obviously did not deserve this. This is pretty ruthless. I mean, we hear about dysfunctional families. I think everybody in the room to some extent comes from one. But this is an extremely dysfunctional family, right? I've got my brother here. I'm sure he would agree that I've done some pretty horrible things to him, but I've never plotted to kill him or sell him into slavery. So this dude had it rough, for sure. And Joseph, he loved his brothers. He did. It might be easy to think, well, when he told them of these dreams, maybe he was trying to prove a point or lord power over them. But when you read the story of Joseph, it's clear that he didn't operate this way. Talking about these dreams with his brothers was really trusting them. He was making himself vulnerable to them. And I don't know about you, but I can relate to this, right? Made myself vulnerable to, who knows, a family member, a relationship I was in, therapists, teachers, these sorts of things, counselors in treatment, only to have it really thrown back in your face. And not because you deserved it. Joseph totally dealt with this. And like us, he had every reason, at least as far as the world would say, to abandon hope, to despair, to fight back, to harden his heart up and not want to listen to anything that anybody had to say. But as you're going to see, Joseph did not do this. He totally chose Jesus. He trusted God. And because of this, God was able to stay with him, able to grow him up and help him save many people. God will do this for you too. We look at Matthew 4:19. It says, come follow me, Jesus said, and I will make you fishers of men. Now we hear that a lot. Even before I was a Christian, I'd heard that over and over and over again in my life. And it says right there, hey, choose Jesus. Choose me, follow me, and I will grow you up and I'll do great things with you. Now, it's easy to believe, as I did in the beginning, that this is Simon, Peter, and Andrew that Jesus is talking to. And it's easy to believe that Jesus just cruised up to them and said, hey, come follow me. And they just happily, skipping on sunshine, abandoned everything that they had and were just more than willing to go follow Jesus. But that's probably not how it went down. I mean, he's asking them to walk away from their dad, from relationships, from siblings, from their entire fishing culture. I mean, this is a big deal to them. This is their whole world. Their livelihood is made this way. All of their friends are in this culture. Part of their identity really is that they are fishermen. This is a pretty brutal culture, so of course there were some obvious things to get away from in this culture. It was a pretty vulgar, rough and tumble sort of deal. And like us, Jesus will very often, of course, ask us to get away from destructive relationships, to get away from, well, as the program would say it, playgrounds and playmates. Jesus was asking us to do that 2,000 years before a secular program ever did. But Jesus will quite often ask us to get rid of some relationships that we get a whole lot of comfort out of. Some stuff that gives us a lot of pleasure. And a lot of times, those people won't understand. I know there are plenty of family members, friends that I have in my past that I love dearly and are great people and don't understand what I'm doing right now. And I would never want to hurt them, but I have to do what Jesus commands me to do. So we must be willing to let go of whatever it is that Jesus is asking us to let go of. We must choose Jesus, but one thing to keep in mind is we can't just get rid of everything that Jesus wants us to get rid of and not replace it with something positive. We have to replace whatever we get rid of with Jesus. Otherwise, circumstances will just get worse than they ever were before. And I know there are some of you that can relate. I know I've done it. Clean house, make it through treatment, got a good job, I'm healthy, but don't replace anything with Jesus. And next thing I know, it's 100 times worse than it ever was before. So choose Jesus and replace what he asked you to get rid of with him. The second part of our equation that Joseph models for us, we must battle the flesh. This is a super churchy phrase, I know. And I'm going to talk about that for a second because before I came to church, and honestly to this day still, when I hear churchy phrases, walls go up. I have all kinds of attitudes that are still in there as a result of where I grew up and the way I grew up. So someone says battle the flesh, and it's almost hard for me just to even really meditate on that because I just think, whatever, televangelist, churchy, love. So we'll talk about this. What is battling the flesh? Well, really, it's whatever our heart tells us to do under our own steam to comfort ourselves or make provision for ourselves. It is not spirit-led at all. It's a very worldly understanding of things. And there are obvious things like, don't do drugs, don't drink, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, stuff like that. But really, it's a motivational thing. And there are a lot more things that are a lot more subtle that would be flesh battles. I mean, is playing a guitar and singing songs, is that a bad thing? No. But if I'm doing it to make people like me, if I'm thinking that this is the identity that I must clothe myself in order to be valid, then I've got a flesh battle on my hands. Is a marriage a bad thing? Of course not. But if I think that my worth comes from my marriage, then I've got a flesh battle on my hands. Is work, is money a bad thing? No, money is not a bad thing. But the Bible says love of money is the root of many evils. Money not a bad thing. Work is not a bad thing. But if we prioritize that above our relationship with God, it will never fulfill us. We will always be searching for more. So that is battling the flesh. It is any treasure that we put above Jesus. And Joseph models this super well. So we'll talk about this. At this point in the story, Joseph has been sold into slavery, and a guy named Potiphar buys him. And this is an Egyptian official. He's a powerful guy in Egypt. So Potiphar buys him, takes him back home, and because Joseph just trusts Jesus, he battles the flesh, he prospers. He has success in everything he does. And not only does Joseph have success, but so does Potiphar. His whole household has success. So that is where our story picks up. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well-built and handsome. Joseph was a looker. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he's entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And right there, he's worried about his relationship with God. Not worried about what Potiphar's going to do to him. Worried about what this means between him and God. And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Man, he was so worried about avoiding the appearance of evil, remaining above reproach, that he didn't even want to hang out in the same room with her. He wasn't just going to friend stamp this thing and convince all kinds of people, set a precedent to do the wrong thing. He knew. One day he went into the house to attend his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by the cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he left his cloak in her hand and run out of the house, she called to her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me. He ran out of the house. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home." Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me. He ran out of the house." When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him, put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness, granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So Joseph obviously battles sexual immorality, battles this sort of temptation, and gets thrown in prison for it. He's absolutely loyal to God, absolutely loyal to Potiphar, is going to do the right thing in every situation, still gets thrown in prison. So he's battling the flesh on those levels, but think about some other flesh battles this guy probably had. Probably a bit of resentment, probably a desire for revenge, I'm sure. Hopelessness, some sort of despair. Probably, I wonder, probably not Joseph, but how many people in his situation, if you're honest with yourself, would say, "I should have just hooked up with Potiphar's wife. I'm in prison anyway," right? Yeah, I know. If it were me, I would want to explain myself. I would want to tell everyone how I'd been wrong. I would want to rally people to my side. I would want to elevate myself back to some position that I thought I had been in, or that I deserved to be in. But Joseph did not do this. 1 John 2:15 says, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of the eyes, the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world." And that's kind of what we talked about earlier. You know, we can fight with the obvious things, sexual temptation, drugs, alcohol, that sort of stuff. But the desire to boast over what we have, what we've accomplished, that's more difficult. And the world will tell us that we have every right to do that. But Joseph illustrated that beautifully. He did not cave to these fleshly desires. He chose Jesus. He battled the flesh. As a result, God was with him, gave him success in whatever he did, even when he was locked up. He totally prospered. He had peace, and he was put in charge of the prison. And he did not do this with his own understanding. He did not do this with his own cunning, his own power, his own manipulation. He didn't do this by operating the way that the world would tell him to operate. He did this by choosing Jesus and by battling the flesh. The next thing that Joseph models for us beautifully is that he served where Jesus put him, and that's what we need to do too. We need to serve Jesus where he puts us. And a brief word on serve. One thing that was difficult for me to figure out, serve is not a commitment to an event. It's a commitment to a process. That's what serving is. It was difficult for me to realize that the specifics of an event, whatever it is, a church service, a meeting, a counseling session, are not nearly as important as the commitment to it, regardless of what you feel like. It's so easy to commit to an event, and then at the last second say, well, okay, here's my reason. Here's my justification. Here's my validation for doing something or not doing something. What's most important to God is that we follow through regardless of how we feel. No matter what things look like. We can always explain how something will work or something won't work. But what's important is not leaning on our own understanding and serving Jesus in a super committed, enduring way, regardless. And where you are is no accident. Regardless of what your circumstances may look like, God carefully crafted your life long before you ever ended up sitting in this seat right now to do very specific things for Him. Right? My life is an example. I'm up here preaching a message. I love standing up here preaching a message. I truly do. This is fun for me. I know that God built me to do this. I would never have known that if I would have done things my way. If I would have followed the world that I grew up in, followed what I thought my identity was supposed to be, I'd be running around the country playing guitars and singing songs and trying to get people to tell me I was cool. That's what I would have done. I never, ever would have thought I would have even been a member of a church, let alone doing everything I can to glorify God by bringing a message. But that's because I finally got to the point to where I was willing to just trust wherever Jesus put me. And He put me in this church. So we'll get back to Joseph at this point. For now, he's serving in prison. And while he's in prison serving, Pharaoh over in Egypt gets mad at his royal cupbearer and his royal baker. And he ends up throwing them into prison, into the same prison that Joseph is in charge of. And at one point, Joseph runs across these two, and he notices that they're just sitting around all mopey, looking totally dejected and bummed out, looking like someone just shot their dog, and Joseph wants to know what's going on. So he cruises up, and he says, hey, why are you guys so sad? What's going on? And this is where our story picks up. We both had dreams, they answered, but there's no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. See, right there, he's giving God credit again. He's in a position where he can elevate himself. People think he's impressive and important, always deferring to God. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, in my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. Well, this is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me. Show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh. Yikes. Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all of his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that once again he put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Of course he did, because that's how life goes for Joseph, right? So Joseph loves the Lord, serves the Lord, gives glory to the Lord in whatever circumstances he's in. Even while he's in prison, even when telling the Lord's truth requires telling somebody that they're going to get impaled and their flesh will be eaten by birds. Now that's being a peacemaker and not a peacekeeper right there. Joseph serves the Lord, but he's willing to rock the boat a little bit if he has to. And all Joseph asks is that the cupbearer tell Pharaoh about him and his circumstances. which of course the cupbearer promptly forgets to do. But Joseph was committed. He was totally committed, not just to an event. He was committed to serving through whatever process God put him through. Ephesians 2:10 says it like this: "For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." Long before we were ever born, it was all worked out, specifically and carefully crafted for each of our lives. And more than likely, like my life, it doesn't look anything like the world or identity or steps that you think you're supposed to take. More than likely, it looks very different because God's ways, of course, are higher than ours. So our circumstances aren't accidental, and what are your circumstances? I know there's some of you out there right now that are in treatment, and a lot of times that can be a drag. I know, I've been through it several times. But I also know that it's been a great blessing. I'm sure there are money problems out there, relationship problems, estranged from kids, legal issues, all kinds of problems. But these problems are not accidental, and if we trust Jesus with them, he will grow us through a process that allows us to get our worth from him instead of our circumstances, no matter what they are. So we choose Jesus, we battle the flesh, we serve Jesus where he puts us, and we're all in church right now, man. Don't get hung up on any preconceived notions. I know I did. I had a lot of ideas about how dorky church was. Or maybe this person had offended me at a meeting, so I don't want to be at this church, you know. Or maybe you don't like who's giving the message. This guy needs a haircut, probably, you know. But don't get hung up on that, seriously. Just serve Jesus where he puts you. You got a family right here, right now. Plug into this family, regardless. It's life-changing. It's changed my life, and I see it change people's lives all around the place. So we choose Jesus, we battle the flesh, serve Jesus where he puts us, and now for the sum of our equation. And this is a super, super, super powerful promise. God will raise you up for the saving of many people. He promises to finish what he started. He promises to conform us to the likeness of Christ. Promises to use us to save many. He will be with you if you let him. So let's talk about how that plays out for Joseph. At this point, Joseph has been in prison for 2 years when Pharaoh, off in Egypt, has some dreams. And he's trying to get them interpreted. So he's going to magicians, all kinds of people trying to get these dreams interpreted. When the cupbearer hears about this, and cupbearer's like, "Oh yeah, I totally forgot about this, Pharaoh, but when I was locked up, I ran into this guy that totally had God with him, and he interpreted our dreams spot on, and I bet he can do the same for you." So they go, they get Joseph out of prison, and Pharaoh tells these dreams to Joseph, and here are the dreams. First one, Pharaoh sees 7, it calls them sleek, fat cows, big old, juicy, tasty-looking cows coming out of the Nile River. And right on the heels of that, 7 super gnarly, like emaciated. It says the ugliest cows Pharaoh had ever seen come out of the Nile River. And those ugly, gnarly cows devour the fat, sleek cows. And it doesn't even look like they'd eaten those cows. It says that the cows looked just as ugly as if they'd done nothing. So Pharaoh wakes up, and he falls back asleep, and has another dream. And in this dream, there's a sheaf of grain that grows up with 7 really fat, nice-looking heads of wheat on it. And then there's another one that grows up next to it that has 7, oh man, burned by the sun, withered up heads of wheat. And that one, the shriveled up, burnt up one, consumes the good-looking 7 heads of wheat. And Joseph says, okay, you know, I can't interpret this for you, but God can. Always deferring to God. And here's what God says. He says the dreams are one and the same. And the reason that God gave you 2 of them is because he wants to let you know that for sure this is what he's going to do, and he's going to do it soon. And what he says is you're about to have 7 years of great prosperity. All the crops are going to grow great. Everybody's going to be living really comfortably. But right after that, you're going to have 7 years of serious famine, serious drought. And it's going to be like you were never even prosperous. So you better start preparing for that. Do what you got to do now. And that's what Joseph tells him. And Joseph says, look, you better go find some people. You better get discerning, wise people together so they can get ready for this stuff. And Pharaoh says, well, hey, you know, obviously God is with you, so we're going to have you do it. And that is where our story picks up. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger, put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt. So, Joseph is in charge of everything at this point, and it all works out beautifully. They have their 7 years of prosperity. Joseph stores up all of the grain, all of the food that they need, and a couple of years into the period of famine, everyone starts starving. All of Egypt is starving. All of the lands around Egypt are starving, but people can go to Pharaoh, who he sends to Joseph, and buy some grain, buy some food. So Joseph is keeping everybody alive, everybody in Egypt alive, everybody around Egypt alive. And, it goes on, the history of this too goes on to talk about how, as a result of Joseph being there was actually a long period of serious Christianity in Egypt until the people that were of that generation kind of died out and nobody knew what was going on. And Joseph also saves his entire family. The story, it's a long story, and I really recommend you read it if you haven't, because it's awesome. But his family is starving at one point, and they go to Egypt because they know they can get grain there. They don't know that Joseph is still alive. They certainly don't know that he's in charge of all of this. So they show up, and Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize Joseph. And he kind of plays with them a little bit. He hooks them up with food, doesn't really even charge them, gives their silver back, but he kind of tricks them into going and retrieving a brother that's not with them, and Jacob, Joseph's dad. So at one point in the story, Joseph reveals himself. It's a great thing. Ends up that all of Joseph's family, 66 people, move to Egypt, and they live in super prosperity. So Joseph saves all of Egypt, saves all of the people around Egypt, saves his own family, saves, countless generations have salvation through Joseph being in Egypt at this time. But still, at the end of the story, Jacob dies. And his brothers at this point are scared. They're worried that really Joseph was just doing all of this stuff to keep dad happy. And they convince somebody to go tell Joseph that Jacob on his deathbed said, hey, forgive your brothers. And when Joseph hears about this, it says that he weeps. He's sad because they still don't realize that everything Joseph has been doing has been for God. And he loves his brothers, and he loved his dad, and he trusts his brothers, and he trusted his dad. And this is what Joseph says. This is awesome. It says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. In Romans 8:28 says it like this, and we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his good purpose. And we see that around here every day, all day. All kinds of crazy circumstances, totally recycled into miracles. And if you're anything like me, I say, okay, but I've not been a Joseph in my life, for sure. I caused a lot of pain. There's a lot of destruction in my rearview mirror, That's okay. That's okay. God says that he's going to work all of that together for those of us that love him and are called according to his good purpose. And maybe you haven't hit what the world would call rock bottom. If you haven't, awesome. You don't have to. 1 Corinthians 10 is a chapter all about gaining wisdom from the struggles of others. And really, that's one of the great things about the whole Bible itself. We read that and we can get wisdom. So we don't necessarily have to end up, like I did, in homeless shelters, treatment centers, halfway houses, all of that fun stuff before we get here. So we can learn from Joseph, from everyone in the Bible. Philippians 1:6, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. It's a promise. He will. No matter what you've gone through, no matter where you're at right now, no matter what your circumstances are, you can decide to choose Jesus, battle the flesh, serve him where you're at, and he will complete what he has started. And we say around here all the time, I remember hearing it for months before I really started to believe it. We want you to win, want you to win, want you to win. We'll meet you where you're at. We'll walk through whatever you're going through with you. It's true. And all you have to do are those three things. Choose Jesus, battle the flesh, and serve him where he puts you. And we're here for you. They're here for me. Man, it's true. You can claim that promise this very second. Would you guys pray with me? Well, Father, I just want to thank you so much for this great day. I want to thank you for every person that's in here. I just ask that really you stir their hearts up, put your hedge of protection around them and just really get this message in there. And whatever circumstances might be going on, just comfort them through it and give them your sort of insight. Let them know that no matter how things look, it's always an opportunity to trust you, and that your power absolutely works best in our weakness. So give us all the ability just to meet each other where we are at, and not feel like we're supposed to be the right thing or say the right thing, that we can just really want to begin trusting you, begin trusting each other. And I know it can be difficult coming into a church, especially at first. It's so easy to think, okay, well, this is church. I'm supposed to do this right. And I just ask you, Father, that you get rid of any of those sorts of ideas, any sort of preconceived notions that anybody in this room might have, and that they really, really, really just want to get a hold of your love, your grace, and be willing to walk into a relationship with you. And we love you so much, and we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.